The winter of 1944 arrived in Western Germany with the kind of cold that made fighting miserable. Freezing rain that turned foxholes into mud pits. Wind that cut through uniforms regardless of layers. Ground that alternated between frozen hardness and clinging mud, depending on temperature fluctuations that made tactical movement unpredictable. Along the German frontier, where Allied forces pressed against the Westwall fortifications that Hitler had ordered defended to the last man, German soldiers who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts found themselves facing enemies whose capabilities and methods they had learned to assess through hard experience. They knew American forces, aggressive, well-supplied, tactically flexible, but sometimes impetuous, dangerous in their material advantages and their willingness to expend resources rather than preserve forces. They knew Soviet forces, relentless, accepting casualties that would break other armies, operating with strategic patience and tactical brutality that made them terrifying opponents. But the enemy they feared most, the commander whose name circulated through German defensive positions with particular dread, was British General Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, the methodical architect of operations that ground German defences into ruin through systematic application of overwhelming force. The fear German soldiers expressed toward Montgomery was not the immediate visceral terror that Soviet advances sometimes provoked, not the anxiety about firepower advantages that American forces created, but something more psychologically corrosive, the recognition that when Montgomery attacked, the attack would be prepared with such thoroughness, supported with such massive material superiority, and executed with such systematic precision that German defensive success became effectively impossible, regardless of German tactical competence or individual soldier courage. Fighting against Montgomery meant not dramatic battlefield reverses, but slow grinding destruction, not sudden collapse but methodical elimination of defensive capability, not hope of tactical surprise changing outcomes, but certainty that British preparation had anticipated and neutralized every German advantage before the battle began. German soldiers captured during Montgomery's operations, interrogated about their experiences and perceptions, expressed this fear in consistent patterns that Allied intelligence officers documented and analyzed. A corporal from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, captured near Geilenkirchen in November 1944, told his interrogators, "Fighting the Americans is dangerous because they have so much equipment, so many tanks and aircraft and artillery. But there is always chance. They make mistakes. They advance too quickly sometimes. They create opportunities if you are clever and brave. Fighting Montgomery is different. There is no chance. He does not attack until every preparation is complete, until every advantage is secured, until defensive success has been made mathematically impossible. You sit in your position and you watch the preparations, the artillery registration, the reconnaissance aircraft, the gradual accumulation of forces, the obvious build-up that tells you the attack is coming. And you know that when it comes, you will fight well and your unit will be destroyed anyway, not through your failure, but through Montgomery's refusal to accept any uncertainty." The assessment captured something essential about why Montgomery inspired particular dread among German forces. American and Soviet commanders accepted risks that created opportunities for German tactical success. American advances sometimes outran their supply lines. Soviet attacks sometimes created exposed flanks. Both Allied powers occasionally gambled on bold operations that brilliant German defense might counter. But Montgomery rejected gambling, refused to accept risks that his material advantages made unnecessary, insisted on preparations so thorough that tactical brilliance became irrelevant because strategic weight made outcomes predetermined. This methodical approach was exactly what made him feared, not because German soldiers could not fight well against British forces, but because fighting well accomplished nothing when Montgomery had ensured that German tactical excellence was simply overwhelmed by British material and organizational superiority. The operational method that produced this psychological effect had been demonstrated consistently since Montgomery took command of 8th Army in North Africa in August 1942. At El Alamein, he had rebuilt British forces after months of desert warfare had left them disorganized and demoralized, had refused to attack until his preparations were complete, despite pressure from Churchill for immediate action, and then had launched assault that achieved breakthrough through sheer weight rather than through operational brilliance. German forces under Rommel had fought with their characteristic tactical skill, but had been ground down by artillery bombardments that dwarfed anything they could answer, by infantry attacks that were replenished faster than German defences could inflict casualties, by tank battles where British numerical superiority simply overwhelmed German technical advantages. The victory had not been elegant or particularly imaginative. Montgomery's critics within Allied command, particularly more aggressive American generals, characterized his methods as plodding and unimaginative. But the victory had been comprehensive and, from German perspective, utterly demoralizing because it demonstrated that tactical brilliance could not overcome systematic material preparation. This pattern had repeated in Sicily, where Montgomery's advance up the eastern coast of the island had proceeded with methodical precision despite terrain that favored defense, where German forces had conducted skillful delaying actions but had been unable to prevent British forces from achieving every objective through patient application of superior resources. It had repeated in Italy, where Montgomery's Eighth Army had fought through difficult terrain against determined German defense, but had maintained steady pressure that German forces could slow but not stop. And it had repeated in Normandy and through the subsequent campaign across France and into Germany, where Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced with the same methodical certainty that German soldiers had learned to dread. The symbolic object that defined German fear of Montgomery was the artillery barrage, that overwhelming cascade of high explosive that preceded every major British attack, that lasted not minutes but hours, that destroyed defensive positions through sheer volume rather than through precise targeting, that announced British intention to accept no risk that firepower could eliminate. German soldiers who survived Montgomery's barrages described them with the kind of detail that trauma burned into memory. The sound that was not individual explosions but continuous roar, the earth that shook continuously, the impossibility of communication or movement or coherent thought during bombardments that seemed designed not just to destroy defensive positions but to break human psychology through demonstration of overwhelming material power. A lieutenant from the 352nd Infantry Division, defending near Aachen in October 1944, described his experience to fellow prisoners. The American artillery is dangerous. They fire a lot. They coordinate with aircraft. They suppress German positions effectively. But American barrages eventually end, and you can emerge and fight. Montgomery's barrages are different. They continue until nothing remains, until every bunker is collapsed, until every position is obliterated, until surviving defenders are so disoriented that effective resistance is impossible. And then, only then, when defensive capability has been systematically destroyed, British infantry advances with tanks and engineers and flame weapons and everything else needed to finish what the artillery began. There is no point where German skill or courage can change the outcome because Montgomery ensures the outcome before the battle begins. This fear was compounded by German recognition that Montgomery's caution was not weakness, but calculated strength. German commanders attempted to exploit what they perceived as Montgomery's excessive caution, tried to create situations where bolder action might have produced greater Allied advantages, hoped that American commanders who favored more aggressive operations might create opportunities that Montgomery's methodical approach would miss. But Montgomery remained unmoved by criticism from Allied colleagues who wanted faster advances, by German attempts to exploit his caution, by any consideration except his judgment about when his forces were properly prepared for success with acceptable casualties. This consistency was itself demoralizing for German forces because it meant that no amount of German defensive skill could induce Montgomery to attack prematurely, could create the kind of Allied error that might offer German forces opportunity to achieve tactical success. The battle that most completely demonstrated why Germans feared Montgomery was Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Ironically, the one major Montgomery operation that failed to achieve its objectives. The ambitious plan to seize bridges across multiple Dutch rivers and thrust into northern Germany had been, by Montgomery's standards, unusually bold, accepting risks that his typical methodical approach would have rejected. German forces had responded with exactly the kind of tactical brilliance that Montgomery's usual methods neutralized. Rapid concentration of armor, aggressive counterattacks, exploitation of Allied mistakes. Market Garden's failure reinforced German understanding that Montgomery was most dangerous when he was most cautious, that his methodical approach was actually his strength rather than his weakness, that the one major operation where Montgomery gambled had created the only significant German defensive success against 21st Army Group. After Market Garden, Montgomery returned to his methodical approach and German fears intensified accordingly. His clearance of the Scheldt estuary, opening Antwerp for Allied supply operations, proceeded with the systematic precision that characterized his successful operations. Extensive preparation, overwhelming firepower, patient reduction of German defensive positions despite difficult terrain and determined resistance. His advance to the Rhine through the Reichswald proceeded similarly, slow by the standards of more aggressive Allied commanders, but unstoppable because German forces could delay but not prevent British advance that Montgomery refused to risk through premature commitment. German military intelligence assessed Montgomery's methods in reports that circulated through Wehrmacht command structures. One analysis from December 1944 noted, "British General Montgomery represents the most dangerous type of enemy commander, not because he is particularly brilliant tactically, or because he takes bold operational risks, but because he refuses to accept any uncertainty that material preparation can eliminate. His operations proceed from understanding that British material advantages make tactical gambling unnecessary, that patient preparation produces victory with lower casualties than bold action, that systematic destruction of German defensive capability is more effective than dramatic maneuvers that might create German opportunities for tactical success. Defending against Montgomery requires not tactical brilliance, but resources Germany no longer possesses: the artillery, armor, and reserves necessary to counter British material advantages. Since these resources are unavailable, defending against Montgomery means accepting inevitable defeat through gradual attrition rather than through dramatic collapse. The assessment was accurate and deeply depressing for German forces who understood its implications. Fighting against American or Soviet forces offered psychological consolation of believing that German tactical skill might create opportunities, that enemy mistakes might be exploited, that individual courage and unit competence might influence outcomes. Fighting against Montgomery offered no such consolations because Montgomery's whole operational method was designed to eliminate the factors where German advantages might matter, to reduce combat to material calculation where British superiority was overwhelming and decisive. German soldiers' letters and diaries from the final months of the war, captured by Allied forces and analyzed by intelligence officers seeking to understand enemy morale, expressed this psychological dimension of Montgomery's impact. One sergeant wrote to his family in January 1945, "We hear that Montgomery is preparing another offensive. The preparations are obvious: more artillery arriving daily, more tanks, more supplies, the methodical build-up that means British attack is coming. Everyone knows what this means. We will fight well, we'll hold our positions as long as possible, we'll inflict casualties on British attackers. But in the end we will be overrun because Montgomery has ensured he has such material advantages that our tactical skill is simply irrelevant." This is what makes fighting the British under Montgomery so terrible. Not that we fear to fight, but that we know fighting accomplishes nothing except our own destruction. The contrast between German attitudes toward Montgomery and toward more aggressive Allied commanders was striking. General George Patton, whose bold operational style and aggressive pursuit operations made him famous among American public and respected by military historians, was regarded by German forces as dangerous, but also as creating opportunities through his willingness to take risks. German commanders studied Patton's methods looking for patterns they could exploit, for moments when American advances outran support, for opportunities that aggressive action created. But Montgomery's methods offered no such opportunities because Montgomery refused to create them, insisted on preparation so thorough that German tactical response became irrelevant. Some German officers, particularly those trained in the tradition of maneuver warfare that characterized German military doctrine, regarded Montgomery with a kind of grudging professional respect mixed with frustration. They recognized that his methodical approach represented legitimate military competence, that his refusal to gamble reflected understanding of how material advantages should be exploited, that his acceptance of slower advances in exchange for lower casualties demonstrated concern for his soldiers, that German commanders sometimes lacked under pressure from Hitler's demands for dramatic results. But this professional respect made Montgomery no less frightening as opponent because it meant his methods were not errors to be exploited, but effective operational approach that German forces lacked resources to counter. The final British offensives under Montgomery's command in early 1945, the clearance of the Rhineland, the crossing of the Rhine, the advance into northern Germany, demonstrated once more why German forces feared him above other Allied commanders. Each operation proceeded with the same methodical precision: extensive reconnaissance, massive artillery preparation, overwhelming application of force at chosen points, systematic exploitation that gave German forces no opportunity to stabilize defenses or launch effective counterattacks. German units fought with the skill and determination that characterized Wehrmacht forces, even in defeat. But Montgomery's preparation ensured that skill and determination accomplished nothing except delaying inevitable outcomes. By April 1945, when German organized resistance was collapsing across all fronts, captured German officers being interrogated about their experiences consistently identified Montgomery as the Allied commander they had most feared facing. Not because he was more aggressive than Patton, not because his operations were more devastating than Soviet offensives, not because his tactical methods were particularly innovative, but because his systematic approach to warfare made German defensive success impossible regardless of German tactical competence. One colonel, captured near Bremen, summarized the German perspective. Patton was dangerous but exciting to fight against. You never knew what would happen, whether American boldness would create American vulnerability. The Soviets were terrifying but comprehensible. Massive forces, brutal methods, relentless pressure. But Montgomery was simply inexorable. When he attacked, you knew the outcome before the battle began. You fought because duty required fighting, but you fought without hope, because Montgomery had eliminated hope through his preparations. That is why we feared him, not because he was brilliant, but because he was certain, and his certainty was justified by the material power Britain placed at his disposal. The assessment captured the essential truth about Montgomery's impact on German forces. In a war that Germany entered believing tactical brilliance and operational boldness would overcome enemy material advantages, Montgomery represented the opposite philosophy, that systematic preparation and methodical execution could make tactical brilliance irrelevant, that patience and thoroughness were more effective than dramatic gestures, that accepting slower advances in exchange for certain outcomes produced victory more reliably than gambling on bold operations. For German soldiers trained to value audacity and maneuver, conditioned to believe that tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages, facing Montgomery meant confronting an opponent whose whole approach negated what they did best, who refused to fight the kind of battle where German advantages might matter, who ground German defenses into ruin through application of material power that tactical genius could not counter. This was why Germans feared Montgomery more than any American commander, not because American forces were less dangerous or because American generals were less competent, but because Montgomery's methodical certainty was psychologically more devastating than American boldness, because fighting against force that accepted no uncertainty was more demoralizing than fighting against force that took risks, because Montgomery's refusal to gamble meant German forces had no hope of exploiting enemy errors that Montgomery's preparations were designed to prevent. In the end, Montgomery won his battles not through brilliant maneuvers or dramatic breakthroughs, but through systematic application of overwhelming force. And for German soldiers who took pride in tactical excellence and operational skill, being defeated by an opponent who simply crushed them through material weight was more psychologically destructive than being outfought by tactically superior enemies. The fear was not of Montgomery personally, but of what he represented. The reality that Germany's tactical advantages were insufficient against enemies who possess material superiority and the operational patience to apply that superiority systematically until German resistance collapsed, not through dramatic defeat, but through inexorable attrition that made continued fighting pointless long before formal surrender made it officially over.